What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be analyzing Gary Habermas and his minimal facts approach. If you don't know, Gary Habermas is considered one of the foremost scholars on Jesus' resurrection. Considering that yesterday was Easter Sunday, I felt like analyzing these minimal facts that Gary Habermas proposes would be a good way to start off this week. It's important to keep in mind throughout this video that these minimal facts don't actually lead us to the conclusion that Jesus resurrected, but we are going to be analyzing why these minimal facts do not lead to that conclusion. So if you want to fuck around and find out how bad these minimal facts are, then please stay tuned. Alright, heathens, where I want to start off first is with the fact that these minimal facts have changed drastically over time. Here's a clip from the John Ankerberg show where Gary Habermas had a debate/conversation with Antony Flew.
That when you were at Michigan State working on your PhD, you were a skeptic yourself, and the fact is the facts brought you to a belief in Jesus. And you have said there are at least 12 historical facts that are virtually agreed by all critical scholars today. I'd like you to let us know what the case is. Start us off tonight.
Well, John, just to name some of those highlights, virtually everybody today thinks that Jesus died due to crucifixion. I mean, John Crossan and others from the Jesus Seminar say that's the most widely known fact in the ancient world. He was buried. He, of course, this event inspired some despair in the disciples. Now, the fact that the tomb was empty is admitted by most scholars, but not as widely admitted as the rest in this list. Probably the single most important fact is that the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. They were transformed as a result. The resurrection was a central message. They preached in Jerusalem. The church was born. We have some individuals like James and Paul, two former skeptics, one a family skeptic, one an outsider who persecuted Christians. And they also came to Christ by experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus.
Okay, so some years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Gary Habermas comes out with his 12 minimal facts about Jesus' resurrection. And apparently this should prove to everybody that Jesus actually resurrected. Of course, as you saw, none of those things mean that Jesus resurrected. But now I want to fast forward in time to December of 2020, when the John Ankerberg show posted up this video where Gary Habermas now has 6 minimal facts. Apparently, his list of minimal facts has shrunk by nearly half. So, I wonder which minimal facts made the cut.
Okay, you start with the first one. You say Jesus died by crucifixion is your first event you want to talk about, including your 6 plus 1.
Of the 6, I would say Jesus was crucified and died. The disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. We're taking them right out of the list.
Okay, so wait. Before we continue, he's going to go through a bunch of things here. Let's handle these first 2 first. Now, the first thing to note here is that Gary Habermas says that these are minimal facts that almost all critical scholars accept. This is the exact same claim that he used like 10 to 15 years ago about the 12 minimal facts. It seems like Gary overshot this whole accepted by almost all critical scholars kind of thing, right? So apparently now they only accept 6. And this is just most critical scholars, which for Gary Habermas, most critical scholars would pretty much just be other Christians. And I guess some skeptical people, but those would be like outliers. When he's talking about critical scholars, he's talking about New Testament scholarship, which is nearly intellectually bankrupt in itself. He also says scholars here and not historians. That's another big thing to really focus on. All right, let's start with his first minimal fact here, is that Jesus died by crucifixion. He says that this is one of the most certain things that we can know about history is that Jesus was crucified. But what is the evidence of this? We can't use the Gospels because the Gospels weren't written in tandem with Paul. They were most definitely written after Paul was writing. Paul is the first one that gives us the indication that Jesus was crucified. But Paul never references any of this happening on earth. There's also no other references anywhere at the same time as Paul talking about how Jesus was crucified. All of the extra biblical sources come much later and are only regurgitating what Christians believed by the 2nd century. So of course these 2nd century Christians are going to think that Jesus was crucified. They've already had at least 2, if not 3 gospels being preached to them. We totally expect them to think that he was crucified. So that's why we have to go with Paul's writings or other people that were writing at the same time as Paul. And what we find is that Paul is the only person out there, along with the other apostles, that were claiming that Jesus was crucified. But the problem is that as far as apostles go, none of them actually say they knew Jesus while he was alive. They only report that they saw visions of him after he resurrected. So as far as Jesus dying by crucifixion, we really don't have any good evidence to solidly say that that definitely happened in history. Of course, people were crucified way back then. Of course, that was a very common method of torture and death. But just because that method of torture and death was common does not mean that a Jewish figure, an itinerant preacher, was definitely crucified and that his followers then sprung up Christianity later. This is certainly not a definite minimal fact of history. The second minimal fact that he covers here is the experiences of the apostles. Now, he says disciples, but Paul never references anybody as being a disciple or even knowing Jesus while he was alive here on earth. So to say that they were disciples that witnessed this risen Jesus is really inserting later information into Paul's writings. This later information would come from the Gospels, which came at least 20 years after Paul had written his accounts down. When Paul meets Cephas, he doesn't reference him as a disciple of Jesus or even knowing Jesus while he was alive. He only references him as an apostle. And an apostle is just somebody that hallucinated a risen Jesus. And that's it. So did people have these experiences? Sure, this, at the very bare bones of it, could be considered a minimal fact. But just because they had experiences doesn't mean that whatever they had an experience of was real, or that the crucifixion happened, or that Jesus died, or that Jesus even resurrected. Now, if we want to compare this to his original list of 12 minimal facts, the crucifixion is still at the top, but then he skips 3 whole facts to fact number 5 for the experiences. I guess the fact that he was buried and the fact that his disciples lost hope and had despair over his death, or that the tomb was empty, are no longer minimal facts that almost all critical scholars accept. Oh my God. All right. What's your next minimal fact?
Thirdly, this was proclaimed very early. We said James D.G. Dunn says months, which could have been the same year. Others say the same year. And it's a consensus view today that this all was on the ground and running by the time Paul came to Jerusalem, interviewed Peter and James, and that's +3. That's only 3 years. Bart Ehrman never gives a certain number that I'm aware of, but he lists a number of early sources, and he has at least 6, maybe 8, from his dating 1 to 2 years after the cross. So early is very, very important.
I don't dispute the notion that the Pauline Creed, the creed that is contained in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, I don't disagree that that popped up early and probably in the early 30s. But just because the belief that Jesus resurrected started at that point does not mean that Jesus actually resurrected at that point, or even that Jesus was even crucified at that point. So I guess as far as the minimal fact of it being proclaimed early, I dispute the idea of early, considering that we can never solidly place when Jesus was supposedly killed. I mean, if you want to assume that he was crucified in the early 30s and that this popped up also in the early 30s, then I would say yes, pretty soon after his crucifixion, the belief popped up that Jesus resurrected from the dead. But that does not mean that he actually did resurrect from the dead. This could have popped up immediately after he was crucified and died, and it still not be a real historical thing that he resurrected from the dead. But you have to ask yourself, where on earth does this pop up in Gary's original 12 minimal facts? The answer is that it doesn't appear. This is a whole brand new fact. So not only has Gary dropped 6 of his minimal facts, but he's actually dropped 7 and inserted a completely new fact. All right, so I'm going to let Gary recap all of the minimal facts that we've already covered.
Some you get crucified, real experiences, proclaimed early, they turned the world upside down. And we mentioned this already, but just to repeat, I don't argue they all have to have died for their faith. I say the ones whose records we have about them going out there and turning the world upside down, especially the big 4, Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, because James, the son of Zebedee, is already dead. He's killed. And Peter and John, the 4 of them, they're turning the world upside down by themselves in Jerusalem and beyond the world. And how do you know they were willing to die? Because they constantly put themselves in situations where, I don't want to say if they died, c'est la vie. I don't want to just say it's nothing. But they were more interested in proclaiming the data than they were as to what happened to them. All right, so that's 4.
All right, just because the disciples had transformed themselves in some kind of way, I really don't think that lends any kind of credence to whether or not Jesus resurrected. They totally could have had a hallucination that felt very real to them, and where Jesus felt very corporeal to them, felt really human to them, and they felt like they really had this experience of Jesus and their lives were transformed. That could have all happened and it just be some kind of hallucination or some other kind of natural explanation that could explain why they were transformed. This does not get us back to an actual resurrection. This only gets back to the belief arising. And this is the big problem with most of these minimal facts, is that these facts only get us back to when the belief arose, or that the belief arose. It does not actually get us back to the resurrection actually happening. I honestly don't care if the disciples were transformed in a way. That really doesn't matter as to whether or not Jesus really resurrected in the first century. Also, he kind of threw in there the whole dying for a lie thing. Obviously, the disciples, whether or not they existed, weren't dying for a lie. They sincerely believed that Jesus resurrected. So I hate the false dichotomy of either it really happened or it was all a lie. They could have, the third option, they could have sincerely believed that Jesus resurrected, even if he really didn't resurrect. If they sincerely believed and they still died, still put themselves in harm's way to proclaim this truth, that still does not mean that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead. Incidentally, I don't think that the disciples even existed. So there's no way they could have died for a lie. All of the accounts that we have of the disciples dying or being persecuted or martyred, they're not reliable. We don't know what happened to the disciples even if they existed. Some of the apostles did die, but we don't know if they were martyred for their faith. A good YouTuber to look up, if you're not already subscribed to him, is Apologia. He's done a lot of great videos on this very subject of whether or not the apostles or disciples would have died for a lie, or how we could have known if the disciples were even martyred. So definitely go and check him out. But the pure and simple fact is that those people that were being martyred for their faith specifically come so much later after the origination of the Christian cult that they definitely were not dying for a lie, or, they weren't putting themselves in danger for something they knew to be a lie. They sincerely believed in the faith. They sincerely believed that Jesus resurrected from the dead. But I also think that the originators of the Christian cult sincerely believed those same things. I do not think that they maliciously made up that Jesus resurrected from the dead. I think they sincerely believe that he did because they read the scriptures. And the scriptures, which are coming straight from God, says that this Messiah figure would suffer, die, atone for their sins, and resurrect. And so they sincerely believed it because, their God told them it was going to happen. You'll commonly hear something similar in order to prove that the resurrection or that Jesus, all of the accounts of the Gospels were true and accurate. But I mean, I think the better explanation is that the originators of the Christian cult just took the Old Testament scriptures and whatever kind of prophecies they could interpret to be the Messiah, and they worked those into the Gospels and into the theology in general. Also, this is plainly seen by Philo of Alexandria, Paul, and Josephus. They all attest to the Jews looking to the Old Testament for these prophecies about the Messiah and then creating a theology surrounding that idea. But of course, we got to ask, where on earth does this minimal fact appear in his original 12 minimal facts? Well, this is fact number 6, so he doesn't jump anymore. He goes directly from 5 to 6 in this particular progression. Let's see where he goes next, though, with his last 2 facts for this presentation.
Crucifixion experiences early turned the world upside down, and then 2 skeptics we've talked about. An insider skeptic, James, a family member, an outsider skeptic, Paul, PhD Old Testament, thought he was doing God a favor by imprisoning men and women, and he says himself, I don't even deserve to be called an apostle. By the way, right after he says that, it's right after the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15. In verse 11, he says, whether it is I or they, so we preach, and so you believe.
Well, yeah, but it's kind of funny how you skip over verse 10, where he says that it's precisely because he persecuted the church. So it's not that Paul didn't meet any of the requirements for being an apostle, so he shouldn't be an apostle, which I know is not what you were saying directly, but I can see people inferring that. As far as being an apostle, he definitely was an apostle. He just didn't feel like he should be an apostle because he persecuted the church prior. But let's go back to his minimal facts. Okay, so first one, the number 5 fact is James was convinced that Jesus resurrected, and he was a supposed family member of Jesus. I don't think that this James was the brother of Jesus or anything like that. I think this James was the Apostle James who would have had a vision of the resurrected Jesus. The only time we get any kind of indication about Jesus having a brother named James is Galatians 1:19. Of course, in Josephus, there's that second passage, but I think that's an interpolation, and this is contested in the scholarship that it says that he was the brother of Christ. And there's no good refutation of that particular position, so I feel like it is more parsimonious with the text to assume that they didn't actually mean like the brother of Christ, but instead brother of Jesus ben Damnius. But in any case, that's a totally different subject. This James would have hallucinated a risen Jesus and not actually seen a real historically risen Jesus, because that would be the least likely explanation for this particular fact. Let's just assume that this James was the brother of Jesus. Even if he was, he would have had this like bereavement, right? He would have been at a loss for his brother. So having a hallucination of your dead relative is totally reasonable. But then we jump to Paul. He obviously wasn't related to Jesus. He didn't even know Jesus before he resurrected. So obviously this proves that Jesus really did resurrect, right? Because Paul had no reason to hallucinate Jesus, except for the fact that he was most likely a schizotypal individual, meaning that he regularly had auditory and visual hallucinations. These auditory and visual hallucinations would have been readily accepted by the Christian cult at that time. In fact, we've got scientific studies now that show how these people that are schizotypal are readily accepted by these groups. So to assume that cult groups in the first century work completely differently than cult groups that exist now, I think is a bit unreasonable. So considering that Paul was most likely a schizotypal individual that was accepted by this first century cult group, I think that natural explanation is far more likely than the miracle supernatural explanation of Jesus resurrecting from the dead. Just because Paul had this vision or hallucination of Jesus does not mean that Jesus actually resurrected. So these last 2 minimal facts really don't prove anything about Jesus' resurrection other than that people were hallucinating that Jesus resurrected. So where do these 2 minimal facts end up on his original 12 minimal facts list? Well, it seems like he completely blew past the resurrection being their central message, which is 7. The apostles preaching this message of Jesus all throughout Jerusalem, that would be number 8. And then number 9 is the church was born and grew. And then 10 is that the Orthodox Jews who believed in Christ made Sunday their day of worship. So 4. He blew through 4 facts there. And then finally, at 11 and 12, it's James and Paul being convinced of the risen Jesus. You have really whittled this down to a list of facts that you really can't determine anything other than a belief arose in the early 30s. That's all that you can really glean from these minimal facts. And this is not something that we would disagree with. I mean, I agree with the scholarship when they say that the belief arose in the early 30s. But just because a belief arose does not mean that something actually happened in order for that belief to arise. And there's a very natural counter explanation to your Jesus resurrection thing, and that would be, as Paul says, as Philo says, as Josephus says, that the early 1st century Jews were scouring the scriptures, that would be the Septuagint, for information about this Messiah, when he was supposed to come, how he was supposed to come, when he was supposed to die, and if he was supposed to resurrect. They read all of these. They did all of the mathematical calculations for when the Messiah was supposed to be coming, and it was supposed to be in the early 30s. That's when the prophecies in the Old Testament that they were reading says that Jesus was supposed to come, live, die, and resurrect to atone for their sins. So it seems like to me that they just read the scriptures and made some shit up at the appropriate time in which Jesus was supposed to resurrect. All in all, Gary Habermas's 12 minimal facts, or his 6 minimal facts, are just so unimpressive. They only get you back to the belief arising, and that's it. I don't know why Gary Habermas is actually considered the foremost resurrection scholar, but people still consider him to be that. I've said it before, and I will say it every time that I cover Gary Habermas. He is not a historian, and he has horrible historiography, especially when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, but also to the historical Jesus. All Gary does is collect these facts to reinforce the belief of people that already believe that Jesus resurrected, just like most apologists. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for the video today. I hope that you enjoyed this look at Gary Habermas's list of minimal facts, how they've changed over time, and why they can only get us back to a belief that Jesus resurrected and not the fact that Jesus resurrected. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you think about all of this stuff that I've covered here today. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens!